In this video, we're going to continue on building our video editor app, and we're going to add a button so that when I select a region and say I wanted to cut this out from my final video, I can just click on this trim button and this region will now be cut out from my final video. In future videos, we'll actually implement the logic so that it actually does cut this region out from the video, so that as we're playing the video, it's just gonna skip through this section because it's no longer part of the video. But for now, all this code is going to do is just add this selected region to the cuts that it's going to save in the state. All right, let's get started. We'll start by going into the edit page where I have my audio waveform component. And since I'm going to be making a lot of changes to this component, including a lot of state changes, then I want to manage it in a separate file where I just have it in my components directory and it'll have its own file for that component. So I'll prompt cursor, I'll provide it the context. My edit page has a lot of components stored in the edit page, and I'd like to separate these out into their own files. Can you provide some suggestions for refactoring this page so that it's importing these components? The state might be tricky because these subcomponents within the edit page share state, so it might make sense to use the context provider. Might make sense to use React context provider in order for these components to share state. I have a components directory where I store all of my components, and then I'm just providing the path to that directory. Please make these adjustments according to React best practices. So I'm familiar with React enough that I know about the context provider and how you can share state between different components even if they're not in the same file. But if you weren't familiar with that, you could just continue the statement with that. The state might be tricky because these subcomponents within the edit page share state. How would you suggest I implement that? And then it'll tell you about the context provider. You could do some research in order to understand it, but ultimately you would end up here, and then you can submit this and we'll see what Cursor responds with, what suggestions it has. I always check that there's no changes here, because I only want to be able to see the changes provided by Cursor. And I actually realized that in these videos you haven't really been able to see the prompt in the top right, because that's where my video is. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put my video in the bottom so that I'm not in the way. Okay, so Cursor just finished, and I can see over here on the left hand side that it created all of these files, and then it made some changes to the edit page. And if I look into the explanation, it made some changes so that it can better organize the components and then also handle the state management according to best practices. So it recognized that there are 4 components: the transcription panel, which is this one. It also identified the video, and then the playback controls, and then the audio waveform. So those are the 4 subcomponents that it created. And it recognizes that these components do share a state, like the playing status, the current time, the duration, and so on. And so it's going to use React context. And here it has a refactoring plan. It creates one shared state. So this is one file where you can manage the state for this page here. So the state that's happening on this page is going to be managed from one file, but all the components will have their own files. And then the edit page is just going to import the components. So it starts by creating the context file, which is the video editor context. And then it creates the separate files for the components. So it goes into the transcription panel, the video panel, playback controls, and then the audio waveform. And then finally it refactors the edit page so that it's importing all of these components along with their CSS, it looks like. No, it didn't create CSS files. So all of the CSS is probably still going to be within this edit page CSS, which I don't see that it's importing into these individual files, but actually it doesn't need to, because it's the edit page that will import the CSS, and it'll still apply to its subcomponents. So after refactored the edit page, I made lots of changes. So as I mentioned that it was going to do in the beginning, before I made the changes, it did create the video editor context. And just like before, created the 4 components and made the edit page simpler and cleaner. And then for each component, it only has a single responsibility, and it has a shared access to the state of the video editor. And the reason we did this is because you can better separate out your code. It makes it easier to maintain and to test it. You can reuse some of these components. Say I wanted to reuse this video component in a different page, or just the audio waveform in a different page, then I can reuse it easily just by importing that single component. And then I wouldn't have to have this audio waveform inside of the edit page file, but then I have a different audio waveform in a different page file. And then I would have duplicate code basically that I would need to manage. And then we have centralized state management, which is that video editor context. And then here's just showing me the file structure for these new added files, and then what happens to the state when I interact with my edit page, which shouldn't have changed. So let's go back into this page. Let's refresh. Let's see, I noticed the lag. This time it seems like the audio waveform is loading slower, but we'll work on that later if it's needed. Let me seek on the audio waveform. Okay, it's working just like it was before. If I click play, it still plays the video from where I seeked it. Okay, that's good. So it does look like everything works as it was before. Let me go into the changes that it made. So in the edit page, it should really just be a ton of deletions. There's really no new code that we should be looking at aside from in here, edit page content. We have this new state, the video file, and then the action. And then this is how we would set that video file. And it's importing, it's using the video editor context. So let's bring up that file. Here it added the state management for that video editor page. And since it's just creating a file, I'm just gonna accept the whole file. And the same thing with all these other components. It didn't overwrite any code, so all the code it generated is new, so I'm just gonna accept all of them. Let me go back to video editor context. And here I can see that it's managing the state for the video file, whether the video is playing, and then the current time, the duration, and then it's creating refs for, and then it's creating references for the video, the waveform, and the Wavesurfer object. It has that helper function to format the time. Here's this event handler, so when you toggle the play, pause, I'm guessing it's going to be a button. Whenever you click on that button, then it'll toggle the status of the video and the Wavesurfer. Okay, and then here's the list of state variables and state updater functions that it's going to pass into the children of this context. So these state variables, they have a value, and then if you want to update the state of them, then you would use their respective state updater functions, which when you call them with a value, like it's done here, set playing, then you're setting, here it's just toggling the state of the current playing status. So when the children of this video context call any of these state updater functions, then it'll update their respective state variables all within this context. Okay, that's the main one that I wanted to look at. Everything else should be just like we had it before. If we were to have taken the edit page and then just copied from the edit page the components with all the logic that it needs in order to display, like for example, this mock transcription. Here's the actual mock transcription, right? And then you have the component to render it. Same with all these others. All we did was take it out of the edit page. So in the edit page, we should really just see a ton of deletions. If we look at what has changed in the edit page, you can see that we just added these imports because now the components are in separate files. And then we initialized the state variable video file and its updater function so that we can use it within this edit page. This is the only one that we're using from the video editor context, and it's because when this edit page loads, then we need to be able to set the video file according to what's been provided to this edit page. But the state variables for updating time are going to be in separate files. Like for example, the playback controls will be using that state variable, and it's not using its state updater function, so it's not using set playing, because all it needs to know is the status. It doesn't need to actually control it, because that action is done by the toggle play pause. Oh, I guess so. It is. This is not a updater function. This is just an event handler, and the event is on click. So when we click on this button, then it will run that event handler, which is also in the editor. Let's take a look. Yeah, so here's that event handler function. All right, so this is actually an interesting approach. I'll leave it as is, but another way that I could have done that is within this playback controls, then when you call this on click, you could have defined like a callback function here. It could have called the callback function here, but let me just stage everything so that way I can just discard any changes that I make right now. So it could have called a callback function here, and then it could have ran the updater function, set playing according to the playing status. And then anything that's listening for this playing status can use an effect hook. For example, if I wanted to display a different icon in here, instead of it saying play, yeah, like that, like play and pause. Here I'm just changing the text that's being displayed, so I can leave it as is, because since this component is listening for changes to playing right here, because it's taking them out of the video editor context, then anytime this playing status changes, then this component will re-render. Basically, anytime any of these values change, it'll cause this component to re-render, so I don't need an effect hook. Then in order for the other components that are listening to the playing state variable, they would need to have an effect hook. For example, in this video panel, I could have a use effect, and then where it listens to the playing status. And here it's suggesting the code, so I'm just gonna hit tab to accept that. But basically here, this video panel is listening for any changes to the playing status. And then when that does change, then it just toggles the play status of the video element. But then I would have to do that for the other components that are also listening to it. So I actually do like the approach it has here, where, let me just discard everything changes that I made. Actually, I didn't even make them because I hadn't saved them. So let me just save them, and then I'll discard them. So what it has before is, it's calling this toggle play pause event handler, which is in this video context here. And then here I have all of the logic that handles the status of the different elements that are listening to that. So this actually is a better approach, in my opinion. Okay, so I'm happy with these changes. I'm just going to ask it to create a git commit message for these changes. Please create a git commit message for these changes. And here's a summary of the changes it made. It implemented VideoEditorContext for shared state. And we've already talked about everything that it made, all the changes that it made. So I'm not going to reread them again, but I'll just commit that. Okay, the next thing we want to do is be able to select on this audio waveform. Right now, if I click and I drag, it doesn't create a selection, it just does the seeking. So I'm going to prompt cursor to do that for me. And because we separated out the logic for the audio waveform into its own file, we would provide the audio waveform as the context now. And then we can prompt it with, when I click on the audio waveform, there's an event that's triggered, and that's the interaction event. And Wavesurfer has an event listener for this interaction that basically updates the current time state in the video editor context. That works really well, and I don't want that to change, but I would like to be able to click on the region, and before I let go, I can drag along the audio waveform, and then it creates a selection within the audio waveform. It's only when I do a single click without holding and dragging that I want the interaction event handler to run. This interaction event is basically seeking on the audio waveform. This interaction event is basically performing a seek. Let me say that. Let me rephrase it. All right, I think that should be good. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I can say. The code should be, no, let me restart. Wavesurfer should be able to distinguish a single click to perform seeking from a click and drag to create a selection on the Wavesurfer object. Okay, that sounds good. Please make the changes so I am able to click and drag to create a selection on the Wavesurfer object. As if I didn't say that enough already. All right, send. No changes so far. Okay, so it actually recognizes that it needs to look at the Wavesurfer documentation, which I should have provided, but I'm glad that it has the ability to look it up. So it recognizes that I'm in version 7.9.4. And it's a good thing that it checked the current version, because if you're watching this many months from now or maybe years from now, then maybe the version is a lot different and the current documentation that Cursor has won't be the same as the documentation for your version. And then it also is checking the video editor context, which is great because I didn't even provide that as the context, but it's going to check that to see what else it might need to add. So it looks like Wavesurfer does have a plugin. It's called the Regions plugin. And then with that plugin, it's able to create selections. So it's going to import the Regions plugin and implement the selection functionality. So let me just run this command. And then after it checked the video editor context, it tried to install Wavesurfer and then a specific version, but then it tried to install the Wavesurfer regions as a separate library. And it kept trying to do that before I realized that was the issue. It kept trying to do that, and then in the logs it says you can see a complete log of the error at this file path. So I just opened up the file path and then it brought me to the logs here, and I just copied these logs into ChatGPT. I asked it what the issue is. I'm trying to install Wavesurfer.js. These are the logs. What's the issue? Provided it with the logs, and then it just tells me that what I was trying to do is download a scoped package that doesn't exist in the npm registry. So the npm registry is a list of libraries that have been registered to npm. And so when you run npm install Wavesurfer.js, for example, then that library would be in that registry. But because I was trying to install Wavesurfer/regions, then it wasn't finding it. So what ChatGPT says to do is just to install Wavesurfer.js, and the regions plugin can be included like so. And Cursor did try that, so it's continuing to try to look into the Wavesurfer documentation to find how to install the regions plugin. And eventually it says, since the regions plugin package seems to not be available as a separate package in npm, let's see if it's included directly in Wavesurfer.js version 7. But it never tried to run another command. It just proceeded to implement directly in the audio waveform. So I can see that there was a glitch here. And I briefly looked at the code that it generated, and it basically created like its own solution for creating these regions inside of the application. So I can select, let's see, I just started, and you can see it. I started clicking over here and it already created a wrong region. And then it created that region. If I click over here to the right just once, and it does seek, so that's good. But if I were to try to drag, it just creates like this weird region that seems to, I'm not sure how it's working, but it only works if the region that you select, anyways, it doesn't even matter because obviously there's a bug with it. And looking at the code, it doesn't look like it's using the regions plugin. So now I'm just going to tell it to try again. Let's see if there's anything in here that I want to keep. No, not really. This is just the part. This is just the part that it created as a solution for being able to create regions on the audio waveform. And then inside of the video editor context, it has a region reference, and then it created some styling. There's not really anything that I want to keep that's important right now. So I'm just going to have it, I'm just going to correct it, and I'm going to tell it how to implement with the regions plugin. And in fact, I'll just take what ChatGPT says. The regions plugin is included as part of the package starting in version 7 plus. You don't need to install it separately. And then install the main, it already has that installed. Use the plugin like this. I'm just gonna provide that, and then I'm gonna give it this code. Okay, give it that code. Can you please try to implement the solution from my previous request using the regions plugin? So I actually could do it this way, but what I'm going to do instead, since I don't really care for the state of this last request, and I don't care if I overwrite the changes, then I'm going to just append this into the previous message. That way it restarts with everything I had said before. Okay, so I'm okay with the rest of this. It does have the code down here. Okay, let's see what it does now. And it's just giving me a warning that if I submit from a previous message, then everything will get overridden. It'll get reverted first. So I'm just going to click continue and revert. That just wipes everything from here, all the changes from last time. And it's going to implement the regions plugin to allow click and drag selection on the audio waveform. And then it's also going to make sure that the existing seek functionality still works. It said it's done it correctly, so the seek functionality should still be working, and it's implemented the region plugin. It said it replaced the interaction event with click for single click seek. So here, I don't think that's gonna work. So I'll just keep a note of this, and then I'll probably just revert that one single line. So let's see if I click. Yeah, it just goes to where I want it to go briefly, only in the audio waveform, but not in the actual video. And then it just goes back to some point in the beginning. Is there any log? No. And what if I drag? I still can't drag. The dragging doesn't even work. So let me undo that one. Oops, what did I do? Let me reject. What's going on? It's not recognizing my hotkey. Okay, whatever. I'm just gonna reject this one. Still doesn't want to accept it. How about in here? Okay, it's because I was working with the working tree file. This is the working tree file. Let me see. It has the region created event. So it has the region created event, but nothing. It's not doing anything. Oh, that's because I'm not sure. Let's try. So the seek still works as expected because we reverted that one line of code. But what happens if I drag? Nothing's happening. Okay. So these aren't even being executed because otherwise I'd see them in the console. And it only updated the audio waveform. Okay, let me modify my prompt. Okay, let's actually, what I'm going to do is stash these. I'll just accept the file. I'll accept it, the whole thing. And then I'm going to stash all these changes. And in a separate thread, I'm going to reuse some of this prompt. And instead of explaining all the stuff that I had in the beginning about what it's doing when I click on the audio waveform, I'm just going to say, please enable the regions plugin for Wavesurfer.js so that I can create regions on the audio waveform. And then I can say, use the plugin like this. Use the plugin as shown below. Let's just delete that. So simple. It's basically, make sure to wrap that in triple backtick so that it knows it's code, although it probably doesn't need that, it'll understand. But just a simple sentence, please enable the regions plugin for Wavesurfer.js so that I can create regions on the audio waveform. Use the plugin as shown below. And then I provide that snippet of code that ChatGPT gave me, although I never checked that it was correct. So I'm going to provide the Wavesurfer documentation and let's see what it does. So it finished, and before I go into the explanation, I want to see if it works. So I added this note here, double click to create regions. Drag or resize regions as needed. So if I double click, then it creates the region and then I can size it. But what I'd like to do is to be able to just like click and then say I want the region to start here, all the way to here, let go, and then it creates a region there. So let me describe that. Let me restart this prompt. In order to create the region, I'd like to click once to start the region and then move the selection either to the left or right to let go of the click and set the end of the region. Let's see if it understands using that. Okay, so it tried again and it hasn't finished running, but it did. Let's just allow it to finish. Let's see, maybe. Oh, I guess it did finish. It didn't. I didn't let it finish executing. So it made some changes, and before I look into it, I want to see if it's even working. So if I click around, it's still not creating the region. If I look into the code, I can see here it is using the regions plugin. It's having mouse down and mouse up, mouse move events. And then here are the event handlers. So handle mouse move. So in the handle mouse move, it is creating a region. Same for the handle mouse up. Let me ask it about the documentation. So let me pull up a new context. And I'm just going to use 4.0 mini. How do I use the regions plugin in Wavesurfer.js in order to create a region? I would like to allow my user to click on the Wavesurfer object, and while they are clicking on the object, they can move the mouse to grow the region, and once they let go, it creates the region. Are there any events that the Wavesurfer object can listen to? Let's send that. I provided it with the Wavesurfer documentation. Okay, region click, region updated, region created. Okay, so I got a response and it's saying that the regions plugin allows you to create visual overlays on the waveform, which is exactly what we want. And they can be resized and moved by the user. Perfect. So make sure you import the regions plugin. Yeah, we made sure of that. And then when creating the Wavesurfer instance, include the regions plugin in the configuration. So that was done correctly from the previous prompt. Right here, we have the regions plugin. And it looks like the way they have it in the example is a little bit different. So when it creates this Wavesurfer instance, it's creating it with a region already there. And then it has these events that I can listen for: the region created, region updated, and region click. So it's just explaining here that I can initialize the Wavesurfer with a region already, like it showed in the example. And then the event listeners allow me to handle the different user interactions. And then the enable drag selection, which is this one right here, that method allows users to click and drag on the waveform to create a new region. And then it has this slot parameter for smoother dragging experience. So it says here, if I want to test out this feature, then load waveform, load the application and ensure the waveform is displayed. Click and drag on the waveform to create a region, release the mouse button to finalize the region, and then I can check the logs to show that the creation and update of regions. Awesome. Okay, so I will take this back and let me just discard these last changes because those didn't work either. And I'm just going to provide this documentation to my previous prompt. I'm just going to delete everything I have there. Make sure I select the right model that I want to use, and I'm using Claude 3.7 Sonnet because it's agentic. I provide it with the Wavesurfer documentation, and then I just paste the details that I got from the other thread. So I can add event listeners for various events such as region created, region updated, and region click to handle user interactions. First, I need to start off by saying, please use the regions plugin in Wavesurfer.js in order to allow my users to create regions by clicking on the audio waveform. And then I can add event listeners. What else do I want to say? And then I want to explain that I want to be able to do these two things. I want my users to be able to click and drag on the waveform to create a region. And when they release the mouse button, it finalizes the region. I think that should be good enough. So let me copy that. Yes, it's okay to revert. All right. Okay, so now it's going to try again to create the regions plugin implementation. And it's trying to install the plugin separately. So let me just say the regions plugin is included with Wavesurfer.js. You do not need to install anything other than Wavesurfer.js, which is already installed. Okay, let me try again. Well, this is using up a lot of my fast requests, but we'll get to a solution. I should have learned from earlier to provide it with the video editor context. Okay, so here it's initializing the regions plugin. Okay. And then again, it's just not doing it correctly. Wait a second. It's working. But in these event listeners, they're not doing anything. So what is causing this to work? Let's see. What events are being fired? Region created, region created, region created. And then it's logging the region. Here's the region that was created. What if I do, does it update? If I click and drag, region updated. Okay, so these are firing correctly. And then I can use this region object, maybe. So it has the end time here. It has a color. I can resize it. Resize is set to true. And then here's the start time. Okay, I think we can work with this. Region clicked isn't being fired. So I know that this isn't really doing anything. Okay, so it is working. If I were to refresh, this is being created. Awesome. And these events are firing, created and updated are firing, but I don't think, if I click, the sticking still works, but this region click doesn't seem to work. So let me just delete this one. What else did it add? So here it's registering the plugin, but I think I can also do what the documentation was showing, is that I can just do it this way. Plugins, region, create, and I don't want to create it with anything. So let me just do it this way. Don't forget to close that bracket. Regions plugin. So here, instead of running all of these methods on the regions plugin, I think I can just, according to this documentation, I can just run them directly on the Wavesurfer instance, which in my case, it's called Wavesurfer ref.current. So let me just replace these here. I can get rid of this line. And then it has some CSS, but this is just styling, so I'm gonna get rid of it, because if I wanted to style, I could just do it later in a separate CSS. Although it does look like this has some styling that I can apply directly on here. So let me see if it's still working. No, it's not. Okay, so according to the documentation, this should have worked. Wavesurfer, but it's not. So let me see, I'm just gonna stage this for now. And then I'm going to say, I'm gonna ask it specifically about this part. Paste that in there. And then the error I'm getting is, why am I getting this error? Paste error. And then I paste the error there. Send it, let's see if it solves it. Oh, you know what? Maybe this needs to be .current.plugins. Well, let's see if it worked, what it suggested. Okay, I'm just gonna leave its suggestion. Let's see what it did. So it creates the region plugin first, and then it just adds it directly in here. Removes that one, that's okay. Accept that. And then the method is applied on the regions plugin, on this. Okay, regions plugin, okay. And then this one we found out we don't actually need. Why did it delete the regions updated? Oh, because it's already up here. Region created, region updated, and then these down here can stay. Let me just first delete this, and that can stay as it is. I'll accept it that way. Oops, let me just undo that. Everything else looks good. I deleted the CSS styling because I can style it. Do I need this one? I'll leave it. Let me refresh. Here's the selections. Okay. Wow, that took a while, but we got it to work. Let's see if I were to create a region. Oh, it just overlaps it. Okay, that's something we'll need to fix because I only want it to, like if I wanted to just create a region over the entire thing, it should just, and then like stop it here. It should create just one region containing everything that was already in there and then extend it, right? Because it's overlapping with this one, so it should just extend it. So I'll create the logic to handle that. But for now, at least we can create the regions, because the next step is going to be to click, or first we need to add a button here where I can called trim. And then when I click on that button, it should completely trim this, whatever the selected regions are, it should trim them out of the audio waveform. But instead of completely deleting them, I still want them to show up. So like, let's say I select this one and this one. Then when I click on the trim button, it changes their color to red, for example. And then when I'm playing the video, it should just like go to that point. And then once it reaches this point, skip to the next part. And the video should also be in sync with the audio waveform, because I don't actually want to do any editing in the browser. All the editing is going to be done in the back end, and I'll explain later why that is. But for now, we don't want to do any editing until we're ready to export this video. So for now, what we wanted to do is like a hack for this editing. So any edits that I make on here, and let's say I trim them out, it'll just skip them, but it'll continue playing the video over those skipped sections. So I lost the last bit of this recording, but don't worry, I'm going to summarize everything that I did for the rest of this video as best as possible so that you can follow along with the code changes that were made in the rest of this video. But in order to do that, I need to pull up the GitHub repo. So here is just the GitHub repo that we've been working with. You go to the commits, and then this video ended shortly before I made this commit right here. So I'm just going to go into that and summarize the changes that we made up to this point. So in this commit, we summarized everything here in this commit message. We implemented the regions plugin for the audio waveform. This is the regions plugin here. And this regions plugin allows users to click and drag on this audio waveform so that they can create regions. And then we added the event listeners for region created and region updated, which are down here. These are the event listeners. And again, nothing's happening. Well, these event handlers aren't doing anything. They're just console logging the status and then the region itself. So if I were to pull up the console log here, let me just refresh this page, clear these. If I were to create a region, it says region created, it's just being console logged, right? And this is the region. And the region has many attributes. For example, it has the end time of that region, the start time. It has this resize flag set to true. So if it were false, then I wouldn't be able to drag around. That's going to be important later. And then it has this color attribute. And lastly, the total duration of, well, this is actually the total duration of the video, not the region. But you can see how a lot of these regions, a lot of these attributes for this region can be configured. Well, I won't get into it now. I'll explain this a little bit later. Going back to the code, we can see that we initialized the regions plugin here, and then we provided it as a plugin to the Wavesurfer instance when we created it. And then another important detail is that the media attribute is also defined in the Wavesurfer so that this can be in sync with the video media. So this is the video media, and this video reference is just pointing to this video tag in the HTML. Another thing that we had to do after some troubleshooting is we needed to run this method enable drag selection on the actual regions plugin instead of directly on the Wavesurfer instance. And that's what got it to work correctly. And then these are just the event handlers that I already mentioned. So that's all we did for the rest of this commit. And that brought us to this state of the app where we can make selections. And the next thing that we're going to do is add a trim button here, so that when a user has made certain selections, for example, say they want to trim out this part of the video, this part, and this part, right? Then they could click on the trim button, and ultimately these will be edited, cut out from the video. But for now, all we want to do is create what's called an edit decision list. In the context of video editing, an edit decision list is a list of instructions for how a video should be edited. So in our app, when we click the trim button and then it trims out these segments, we're adding these segments into the edit decision list. So we're just going to call it trim history. And the purpose of an edit decision list is so that you can work with a lower resolution version of your video. Say, for example, we have a long video, 30 minutes long, 4K resolution. We wouldn't want to work with that version of the video directly. We'd want to work with a lower resolution video, especially in the browser. And I'll explain in a minute why that is. And so you would create whatever edits you want to your video. In our case, it's just going to be a simple trimming that we're going to do. We're just going to apply trimming to the audio waveform, and those will be added to the edit decision list. So the format of our edit decision list is just going to be an array that's going to have the segments, so the start time and the end time, and these will be stored in the array. And the reason we're doing it this way is because we can't process videos in the browser over a certain limit, over 2 gigabytes. There's this library called WebAssembly that makes it possible, but it's limited to 2 gigabytes. And so if we had a file that's larger than that, then we wouldn't be able to make these edits in the browser. And so what we want to do is display a lower resolution version of the video to the user as they're interacting with it, making any kind of edits that they want, applying any trims. And then that list, along with the video, are going to get sent to a backend server. And the backend server is handled by us, right? Whereas the client, the browser, is on the user's end. And we can't expect our users of the browser to have really powerful internet speeds or really powerful software or hardware. And so we would want to do the heavy lifting of editing the video and processing it, right? Creating all these cuts and then stitching the remaining parts together. We can do that with our server, which would be deployed, and we can scale it however we need so that it can handle really large video files. But let's just say that we were to do it in the browser. There's this library called WebAssembly that makes it possible for you to run code in the browser that you normally wouldn't be able to run because that code was written in C++, C, Rust, or any other language that's not written for the browser. And there's this library called FFmpeg that, if you've ever done any kind of video editing with the terminal, you've probably used FFmpeg to make automated edits to your videos without having to use the software. You just use it in the command line. And we can run FFmpeg in the browser using WebAssembly. So our FFmpeg would be our C++ code. I'm pretty sure it's written in C++. And WebAssembly makes it possible to run this in the browser, right? The limitation is that in the browser we can only work with 2 gigabytes, up to 2 gigabytes of memory. So if the video file is larger than 2 gigabytes, then we wouldn't be able to process it. So I looked into doing it this way before recording this video, but then I found out about that limitation. So we're gonna have to go with the old school way of sending our video to the backend. And let me just draw what that looks like. So we have the browser, right? The browser is our client that users interact with. And so when a user uploads a video to the browser, the user uploads that video into the browser, and then the browser sends that video to our backend, which would be our server. And so the server, it can be any size that we want. And because it can be any size, then we can process any size of video in our backend. So I'm just going to draw this circle to denote processing videos. And so the server handles any heavy lifting. And then once that video is processed by the server, Then the server sends that video back to the browser and the user can download that video. And this processing can be inside of your server, it can be done within the server itself, or it can be set up as a Lambda function or something similar, but that's beyond the scope of this project. In the simplest scenario, your videos are just processed in your server. Okay, so in order to get this trim button on here, we need to prompt cursor, and I'll just show you the prompt that I used along with the code that I generated. The prompt says, I would like to add a button to my playback controls called trim when the user clicks on the trim button. It will make a note of all the selected regions in the audio waveform component and add them to the trim history state. These regions need to change color in order to distinguish them from new selections. And the context that I gave it was the audio waveform and the playback controls, because in order for the trim button within the playback controls to be able to work with the trim regions that were selected in the audio waveform, then they need to have a shared state where clicking on the trim button will affect a different component, which would be the audio waveform. And so if we look at the code that Cursor provided, it says that it's going to update both the playback controls and the audio waveform components. But first it's going to look at the current state and then make any necessary changes. So within the video editor context, which is the context that we use to manage the state of this entire page, remember all of these components are interconnected. Like this video eventually will be connected with this transcription, and the transcription will be connected to the audio waveform and the playback controls. They're all going to be interconnected. And so that's why we have this shared state called the video editor context. And so the first thing that Cursor does is recognize that it needs to look into the video editor context to include a state for the trim history, our edit decision list. So it initiates the state with an empty list, an empty array, and then it creates a handler function to add trims to history. It's a callback function. First it checks that the Wavesurfer component is present. Then it gets the regions, these regions here, from that Wavesurfer component. It makes sure that there's regions that are selected by checking the length of that list. And then using that list of regions, it's going to create a new array, just extracting out the information like the ID, the start time, and the end time that we saw here when we pulled up the console. You can see that the region, each region has all these attributes. And so we're just trying to take out the start time, the ID, and the end time, and then assigning it a timestamp for, I guess, for when this region was extracted. And then it's setting the trim history, and it uses a callback function so that it makes sure to consider what was already in the trim history and make sure to add that into the final list. And then it includes any of the new trims that we got from making new selections. And then this callback function returns these new trims. And then if we scroll down, we can see that this trim history state and the set trim history state updater are being exported by the video editor context. Let me pull up that file, and it'll actually be easier to see if I were to go back into GitHub. So let me go to the last commit that we made so we can see the changes that were made in this final commit. So I'm looking for a video editor context file. Here it is. Here's the function add trims to history, and we can see that these functions have been added to the value. And when they're added to this value, you can see that this is the value that's passed into any of the children of this shared state, the video editor context. And like we said, all of these components here, the video, the transcription, playback controls, the audio waveform, they're all sharing that state, and so they're all children of that shared state. So if we continue looking at what else the cursor updated, we can see that it added in the audio waveform component, it added logic to change the color of the trim regions. So the audio waveform is now taking in the trim history, which is a new state variable that we added into the video editor context. So it's just making sure to get that from the video editor context here. And then within the audio waveform component, it's going to add an effect hook that listens for any changes to the trim history. And just like before, we're going to check that the Wavesurfer object has been instantiated, Then we're going to get the regions from that instance. And then for each region in the Wavesurfer instance, it's going to check against the trim history and confirm that the region is in the trim history by comparing the IDs. And if that region is in the trim history, then it's going to assign it this color. It looks like it's going to be a red color. And then it just applies some additional styling for that selection. And then the next thing it's going to do is update the playback controls component to add the trim button. That's going to go somewhere here. So the playback controls is going to have access to this add trims to history. Remember, this was the callback function that was added inside of the video editor context right here. And this is what sets the trim history state. So that function to update that state is going to be used within the playback controls, which is expected, right? We would expect that this component, the playback controls here, would be the one to make the call to update these regions and add them to the trim history. And so here we have the handle trim callback function. And this callback function is called when we click on this button, and this is going to be the trim button. So once we click on that trim button, we call this handle trim function. We call this function from the video context editor so that we can create new trims from the selections and add them to the history. So when it calls this add trims to history, it's going to get the new trims. And if we go back to that function that's in the playback controls, we can review and see that it's setting the trim history within here according to what was previously there, and then the new trims that it got. And then going back to this playback controls, it's not doing anything with these new trims. All it's doing is console logging if there were any new trims, and if not, it also sends a message. And the next thing that Cursor recommends is to add some CSS to style the trim button to ensure that the playback controls looks good. So here's the CSS that it generated. It's just CSS, and we're probably going to change this, so I'm not going to go into this. Because right now our app doesn't have like a consistent theme. You know, we have different colors for all these things, and eventually once we do get this ready for production, we want to have consistent colors. But for now, I won't worry about the CSS. Lastly, it's just going to import this CSS into the app so that it applies it to the playback controls, and then it's just going to run this command line to make sure we're in the right directory before we start up our application. And when it ran this, it looked at the logs and it saw that it ran without issues, and so it continued to summarize everything that I just talked about, all the changes that it made. But at this point, when I made this implementation, I had an error, and this error showed up in the console. And I won't get too in detail about what this error meant, but it just said Wavesurfer.ref.currentGetRegions is not a function. And the issue was that the implementation was using or was applying the getRegions method onto the Wavesurfer instance. And the solution was to apply the method instead to the regions plugin. So it was the similar issue as what we saw before when we were trying to get the regions from the Wavesurfer instance instead of the regions plugin. And so here's just the correction that it made. Inside of the video editor context, it just made sure to create a reference for that regions plugin. And remember, that regions plugin is within our audio waveform component. So if we open up the audio waveform component, we can just search for regions plugin. And here's the region plugin. So in order for the video editor context to be able to control this DOM element, it would need to create a reference inside of this video editor context, which is what it's doing here, where it initializes it. And then it's going to pass in that regions plugin reference to its children here in the value. And then here in the audio waveform component is where we assign the value of that reference here by just setting the current attribute to this region plugin instance. So because we've assigned the value here, now the video editor context knows exactly what it's going to control up here in the reference. And so for the rest of the code of the video editor context, all we do is check that the Wavesurfer instance is existing, as well as the regions plugin. And if it doesn't, then it's not initialized, so it's just gonna error out. But if it does, then it proceeds to this part of the code where it gets the regions from the regions plugin instead of the Wavesurfer instance. And that was the cause of the error. All we had to do was make this change. And then again, when we get these regions, there's no regions, so it returns a length of 0, then we're just gonna console log no regions found to trim. And that was the final change that it made, so it didn't make too many file changes. If I go into the GitHub repo, we can take a look at all of the changes that were made, but it was just a few that I already talked about. In the app.js file, it's just importing that CSS for that trim button. In the audio waveform, it's importing the regions plugin reference so that it can assign the value here. It's taking in the trim history from the video editor context so that as this changes, it can run this effect hook that I already described, where all it's doing is changing the color of the trim regions. And then in the playback controls, we have the add trims to history callback function that came from the video editor context. And the reason we want that here is because whenever we click on that trim button, we want it to be able to execute, and that's executed by this onClick handler right here. And then lastly, in the video editor context, I'm just summarizing everything I already talked about, but just so that it's complete. We have the trim history and the set trim history updater function being initialized so that now they're part of the shared state. And then we have this callback function, which is executed by clicking on the video trim button. And then it's just adding these values here into its value object so that it can pass it to the children. And finally, we have the CSS for the trim button. So now after all of these changes, we end up with this. And you can see if I were to make a selection here, and selection here, and I click trim, then it colors them red. And if we look at the console logs, we can see this console log for add trims to history. It's an array of these 3 objects. And it has the end time, the ID, the start time, and then the timestamp for when this region was created or added to the trim history. All right, in the next video, we're gonna add another button, and it's gonna call detect silence, and it's gonna do just that. Whenever there's silence in our audio waveform, so let me just refresh here. For example, right here, there's some silence. Then here, there's some more silence. And here is more silence. Then when we click the detect silence, it'll detect these silences and then automatically add them to the trim history so that if I wanted to just remove any silences from my video, then I can do that. And so that's why we needed to add this functionality first for the trimming of these created regions, so that when we click on the detect silence, it can just do that functionality that we just integrated.